Hi, everybody. Welcome to the third talk in our series on the erotic as power, or walk through the law. Thanks for coming on. This time we're going to talk about something which, frankly, I'm not that excited about talking about it, but somebody's got to. And so here I am. And we're going to be talking about the development of the sex trafficking laws, both under international law, which is kind of where they started, and under domestic US law, and then a few other jurisdictions. And so we are going to go quite heavily this week into some sort of academic legal stuff, the drafting of treaties, the drafting of legislation, how Congress makes laws, how the sausage gets made. And the key topic is kind of what happens when there's ideological capture of an important topic, and how does that influence the law. And so one of the things I really battled with as I was preparing for this talk is the phenomenon of outrage. Because in reading, I consider myself to be an adopter, and I'm faced with the rules and philosophies imposed by all of these conservators of various stripes, whether it's radical feminists or Christian fundamentalists, or a quite remarkable alliance of the two, which is what happened in relation to the development of sex trafficking under international law and under domestic law. And it's very easy to begin to start to drink the poison of outrage. And the second you do that, you actually become part of the same trance around sexuality, around difficult topics that you're trying to address. So you're trying to address it, but you really have just become, entranced yourself by the outrage, and like, how can this be? And can't they see that, X, Y, and Z? So that's something to, as I'm going to give you a lot of quotes from, things the Bush administration said, which are deeply, against what I believe about healthy sexuality in our society. Try to monitor your own outrage response, and notice, like, okay, if I feel outrage, what is the deeper level? What is the level below that that I can bring to this? And there's a great concept in Buddhism of the far enemy and the near enemy. And the near enemy is much easier to spot than the far enemy is. Sorry, the far enemy is easier to spot than the near enemy. So hatred is a far enemy of compassion. So if you hate something, you obviously don't feel compassion towards it. You just want to maybe destroy it or eviscerate it or do away with it. And so it's hard to see, it's easier to see like, well, that's not compassion, that's not love. But outrage is the near enemy, because outrage can look like compassion. And I think this applies to the conservative side of this, to the radical feminists, to the Christian fundamentalists too. They want to protect. They want to protect vulnerable women. They want to protect a certain moral code. They want to protect the liberties of women. And both sides, it's very easy to get wrapped up in outrage rather than what you're actually aiming for, which is compassion and understanding and clarity. So to give another short example of this, with love, and these are my examples, they may not be correct or, sort of right in the Buddhist sense, but with love, the near enemy of love is aversion. Like, if I hate ice cream, it's very clear, like, I don't have love for ice cream, I have hate for ice cream. But attachment is the near enemy. It's where I get so enmeshed with, I cannot function without my ice cream, that, it's close to love, but it's not love. And that is where we very easily get stuck in outrage. And from an erotic perspective, this is an outgrowth of tumescence. And so there are a whole series of sutras dealing with the phenomenon of tumescence, which is really power waiting to be converted. And so much of our legal framework, whether it's around gun control or whether it's around the environment and how to combat climate change, are some of the most tumesced fields that we have, because there is all this desire, there is all this passion, there is all this aversion and attachment, and it's this cocktail of things that come into the lawmaking process, which makes it so hard to put your attention on, and nobody really wants to know the details or find out about it, because it sort of knocks our limbic system so out of whack that we either become like an eternal crusader, that I'm going to be the one who dives into this field, or we become just like, I'm not going to focus that, I'm not going to look at that. And so but there's a way, and I always remember Nicole Dedone telling the story of engagement in a way that actually brings your erotic body alive and actually makes you brighter and better. And she talks about when the HIV/AIDS epidemic was beginning to take root in the Castro and in other areas and other cities like New York and LA, those that were willing to confront it and dive in and engage were like actually got kind of brighter, while those who were just sort of trying to party their way out of it and pretend it wasn't happening got dimmer. And so there's a way to engage in these topics that actually makes us brighter and more erotically alive. So I'm going to be looking at there's one resource that I really dug into a lot for this topic, which I thought was a great article, and it's by Professor Janie Chuang, and it's very long. It's from the University of Pennsylvania Law Review. It's 13 years old now. It's from 2010, and it's called Rescuing Traffic from Ideological Capture: Prostitution Reform and Anti-Trafficking Law and Policy. Sort of typical academic, long, big, meaty title, but it's very well researched and it's very well written, and captures a lot of these ideas beautifully. And we're going to go into some pretty horrific stuff in there. And the thing you should know, that in the 13 years since she published that, things have only gotten much, much worse. So as bad as it seemed like it was in 2010, it's really gotten a lot worse, but I think it's on the verge of getting a lot better. And another resource that I've looked at, we won't talk as much about it, but I want to mention it because it was very good, is an article in the UC Davis Law Review in 2020, 10 years later, called Trafficking to the Rescue. And she actually is a clinical professor who works with trafficking victims and live trafficking cases, but also teaches at Boston University on this topic, and was asking, for as much as we want strong law to be able to address what are some of the worst crimes that exist, we do need to look at the kind of ideological spread and the way they're affecting the law and the way the law is interpreted, and actually getting to the point where it's undermining these draconian laws are beginning to undermine the ability to protect victims of sex trafficking. Okay, so Jenny Chuang's, I hope I'm getting her name right in the pronunciation, her article really focuses on how did sex trafficking actually develop. And a lot of this came about in the sort of mid-1990s at a time where globalization was growing in a way that we'd never seen before. Like the numbers of people that were moving across boundaries, the economic growth that was being experienced in countries like India and Mexico, and the ability of people to cross borders and migrate to find better opportunities was, changing in ways it never had before. And so what you were finding in that environment is that there was a lot of people taking advantage of these tremendous disparities in income and in these tremendous flows of people across borders to engage in forms of trafficking in humans. So, this would be things like, migrant workers smuggled into the country, or agents that help workers come in. But then when they get there, they confiscate their passports and they hold the threat of sending them back home or some other threats over their life. And so there were lots of people in the middle of this, abusing these large flows, and there was lots of money at stake. And so the Clinton government and a lot of international actors and international agencies wanted to develop a protocol for trafficking in humans, both the sex trafficking side of it and sort of the migrant labor side of it. And one of the things that Jenny Chuang argues in her article is that the sex side, even though it's actually a smaller proportion of, the actual amount of activity that's happening, got almost all of the attention. Why? Because sex sells, and it's easier to get people's hearts and minds involved. It's much easier to make a big issue out of it. And in some ways, it avoids some of the harder questions of, all these developed nations, all of their industries and all of their governments actually rely on, large amounts of migrant labor that aren't necessarily being treated that well. And, the military uses contractors and stuff in foreign countries. Where they work with contractors who are, how they get hold of their workers is done in accordance with local norms. And so those are a little less convenient to look at, but this idea of the victim of sex trafficking is such an emotionally charged topic that it was easy to make that the focus. So they began to work on this protocol. And what she says is that it very quickly shifted from, what as they went into these talks about this protocol, it started out as being, okay, how do we create. So I'll start with the 3 Ps. So the sort of animating principle behind this, which is, I think, still the case today, is 1, the prosecution of trafficking, 2, the prevention of trafficking, and 3, the protection of trafficked persons. So prosecution, prevention, and protection. And a lot of the agencies and academics and, you know, kind of policymakers and activists who were involved in this process were hoping that what would be done is strike the right balance between, you know, legal measures to control this and the human rights and ability to help the people that were subject to this. So this is where they would hope the debate would have been. But very quickly, that debate was overtaken by a debate about whether trafficking should encompass voluntary prostitution. And so you had sorry, I'm just trying to find my so you got a group of people, both the sort of Christian right and a group of radical feminists who regard prostitution as inherently coercive, and therefore it is by definition trafficking. And so anytime there is sex and money exchanged, they wanted this to be regarded as trafficking, and that's what they were pushing for. And in fact, when the Bush government came into power, right as this protocol was being adopted, they really sided very strongly with the position that prostitution is inherently coercive and effectively that no woman could ever actually consent to being a prostitute or for selling sex for money. And they made that State Department policy published on the website very prominently, and I'll try and read some of that for you. And they also made it, they used the economic power of the state to drive this forward. So one of the things they did was to say that if you want to work in the space of HIV/AIDS and you want to rely on federal grant funding, we are going to make that federal grant funding conditional on you adopting a proactively anti-prostitution stance. So basically, federal funds that were set aside for HIV/AIDS, which in the mid-90s was a huge, huge issue. You know, I was living in sub-Saharan Africa, and you know, there up to, depending on which country you're in, up to 30% of the population was suffering was infected with HIV, and the AIDS rates were not far behind that, because at that point the medicines were not yet widely available. And so, you know, people are really, the life expectancies across sub-Saharan Africa were plummeting. And then you've got this government that's at the same time imposing this kind of doctrinaire anti-prostitution stance, you know, if you wish to engage with that. Now, who are the people that are getting HIV/AIDS? Often it was prostitutes and truckers. So if you want to engage with it, those are the people that you're going to need to engage with. And so all of these organizations that might otherwise be, you know, handing out condoms to sex workers or educating them about that, they couldn't do that if they hoped to receive federal grant funding. And many of them were just like, well, we'll never apply for federal grant funding. And, you know, others sort of kind of towed the line about that. But that was, you know, official government policy around that. And so that sort of abolitionist the attempt to abolish sex work entirely was, you know, a huge part of the development of sex trafficking law in the United States. And in the 10 years since Janie Chuang wrote that article, it's actually moved even further along, because in the last 10 years, more and more of the cases and the law have widened the definition of what a commercial sex act is, so that it covers a lot more than what you might consider to be, you know, standard prostitution, where you go to some place and you pay some money and you have a sexual encounter and you leave. And in recent both civil and criminal sex trafficking cases, the courts have determined that what qualifies as a commercial sex act can be very broad indeed. So I'll give you one example from the case of Ardolph versus Weber. Bruce Weber was a very well-known fashion photographer, and you know, he would do all kinds of work, but he often worked with gay models and athletes, and he himself is gay. And there were allegations made that as part of his process of getting people ready to be photographed, and you know, it's a very human thing, especially if you're trying to take sexy photographs, that you have some interaction with the model to elicit the kind of response that's going to look good on film. And so he would do various breathing techniques with people, and he would kind of touch them and, you know, through their clothing. And a group of models sued him civilly. So under the US sex trafficking regime, there's two sides of it. There's the criminal side, which gets prosecuted at either state or federal level, where, you know, the state would bring an indictment and prosecute it. And there is the civil side, where if you are a victim of sex trafficking, you can civilly sue your trafficker, the perpetrator, for civil damages. And so this case against Weber was brought civilly by a few models who said that you know, they engaged in this commercial sex act with him. And so, and the way that they interpreted those cases is quite worrying, and we'll probably get into that in the next talk. But that's kind of where things have moved on to. So, but we're going to rewind a bit to this prostitution trafficking debate, where on the one hand, you got one faction that says all prostitution is de facto trafficking and should be prosecuted as such, and another group that says, hold on a second, you know, we should provide for either the reality or the desirability. On the group on the other side, they were either, look, sex work, whether it's whether it should exist or not, it does. And you know, people are engaging in it. And if you're going to make any kind of sex work trafficking, you're going to be harming particularly the women who are involved in that field. And then there was another group that's, you know, says like, look, we understand that trafficking is a problem, but there are people who want to do sex work, and women who want to do this should have the right to do this. So it's almost like a right to work issue. That's how it got treated. And so these factions were in this huge debate around sex trafficking law, and it sort of ended up around the international protocol. as a bit of a stalemate, where what Jenny Chuang calls the neo-abolitionists, those who wanted to get rid of prostitution altogether, got some of the language that they wanted in it, and the people who saw sex work either as something that you should tolerate and manage because it's happening on a very wide scale, and if you don't do that, you can't actually help these people, or people who were pro-sex work for those who wanted to do it and where consent to the activity could be shown. They each sort of walked away thinking, okay, this is not ideal, but I can claim that for the abolitionists, it went, I can go beyond. There was language inserted that said, it's not just force and fraud and coercion. Other forms of exploitation could become sex trafficking. And so they opened the door to move further. And the other side said, well, okay, even though there's this expanded language, provided there's consent, we should be okay. And so it was this awkward stalemate. But really the kind of neo-abolitionists were in the ascendancy, especially around the time of the Bush years. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can find the the government's statement on this, because I thought this was just quite interesting. So in December 2002, this is in the kind of first years of the Bush Junior administration, they adopted policy NSPD 22. And it says that US anti-trafficking policy is based on an abolitionist approach to trafficking in persons. So, and I'm going to break this down a little bit. So trafficking in persons is, you know, obviously we want to abolish trafficking in persons. So it starts out pretty good. Most people can agree with that. Question comes in of what do you define as trafficking? So then we're going to get into interesting territory. And our efforts must involve a comprehensive attack on such trafficking, which is a modern day form of slavery. Now, this is an interesting question because under international law and national law, slavery is one of the most heinous crimes with the most serious consequences. It's one of the few crimes under international law where it's been internationally agreed. You cannot, no state can make any law that derogates from the prohibition against slavery. But what they're starting to try and do here is say, well, we're going to abolish trafficking. But now remember, when we say trafficking, we mean all forms of prostitution, even if voluntary. And we're going to call it slavery. So it's a very interesting thing where in one word, we're saying we're going to take away your freedom to choose what you want to do, but we're going to call that we're getting rid of slavery. So we determined what your slavery is. Now we're going to protect you from yourself. So then it continues. In this regard, the United States government opposes prostitution. So in this regard, so in regard to trafficking, so now we oppose prostitution and any related activities, including pimping, pandering, or maintaining brothels, as contributing to the phenomenon of trafficking in persons. Now, one of the neo-abolitionist movement, the feminists and the Christian right, one of the things that they say is that if you tolerate any form of prostitution, you open the gates and you open the way for trafficking, because you tolerate a market in this. Once the market exists, you get bad actors who use force, fraud, and coercion to lure people into prostitution, to steal their earnings once they're all these very bad things. and that's a plausible viewpoint. There are a lot of counter arguments, but that's a plausible viewpoint. And so that's how they do that. So then they say these activities, so now bear in mind, they're just talking about prostitution now. They're not talking about trafficking anymore. So they're saying any form of prostitution are inherently harmful and dehumanizing. So that's a statement by the government saying that it doesn't matter what the circumstances are. So effectively, they're saying, Nevada, which has legalized prostitution, very regulated to ensure that those who engage in it have good working conditions and have labor protections and everything else. This is government policy now that what Nevada is doing is inherently harmful and dehumanizing. The United States government position is that these activities should not be regulated as a legitimate form of work for any human being. So it's a very clear moral stance they're taking. And I think if we go back to our earlier talk, it comes back to this notion of the erotic. Is the erotic something that is valuable in our world, or is it not? And the viewpoint of the government here appears to be that certain forms of erotic expression, where they involve the exchange of money, should simply be outlawed. And so I don't know what they say about the rest of the erotic, like within the context of marriage or other institutions. They don't talk about that here, but they certainly do say, in this area, there should be no capacity or ability for erotic expression. And to me, that's quite troubling. Okay, so let me see if there are a few wrapping up thoughts that I want to leave you with before we go to questions. Oh yeah, one thing I do want to talk about briefly is, there's a writer, Elizabeth Bernstein, who's mentioned a lot in Jenny Chuang's talk, who really talks about these, what she calls carceral paradigms of social justice, where the solution to a more just society is put perpetrators in jail, and a militarized form of humanitarianism. So, this is the kind of there's a film by the makers of South Park, Team America, and they've got the song, it's America, fuck yeah, coming to save the motherfucking day, yeah. And that is sort of the paradigm that she's pointing to, that, if we just lock up enough people and we just bring a sort of a coercive military approach to this, we'll be able to solve these problems. Well, the evidence doesn't bear that out. You just have a highly incarcerated population with very high levels of recidivism, and a large part of your population in an extremely unhealthy environment. And so the paradigm around that is problematic. And then the second thing I'm going to leave you with is that, this neo-abolitionist movement of the radical feminists and the sort of Christian right has a precursor. And the precursor was a moral panic in the early 1900s about white slavery. And one of the federal pieces of legislation that affects prostitution that's still on the books today and applied is the Mann Act, which was also known as the White Slavery Act. And there was this concern about, white / Caucasian / European women going to other countries, like, I think want to get the countries right, but I think it was places like Turkey, Morocco, possibly India, and working as prostitutes for the wealthy in those environments. And so there was this moral panic about the purity of our women who are being stolen away to go and work in these horrid environments. And now I don't doubt some of those environments were really horrible, but what's at the root of this is less a concern for the well-being of those women than an idea of moral purity for its own sake. And, and it also is kind of inherently racist. And it leads me back to and this LA Times article that was written in 1911. So it's 1 year after this Mann Act gets passed and the height of all this white slavery panic, where the headline was "A Hindu apple for the modern Eve, the cult of the yogis lures women to destruction." So you get these yogis coming from the West, either sent by their own teachers or deciding to come and bring the message of yoga and the practices of yoga to a Western audience. And, women were many of the first devotees and adepts of this practice. And they really didn't like women choosing to consort with these brown-skinned men. And so there were these nakedly racist attacks on the practices of yoga and the people who were practicing it. And, this is like the kind of 2.0 version of our law around trafficking, and our policy around trafficking has the same kind of roots, where it's more rooted in an idea and an ideology of moral purity than it is in an actual concern for the well-being of the human beings involved. Janie Trang does a lot of work looking at kind of the ways that this ideological approach has us not, because she's not even necessarily pro-prostitution. I think she says somewhere in her article that if you actually addressed all the socioeconomic factors, then prostitution wouldn't necessarily exist. I don't know that that's true, but she's definitely not arguing for prostitution. She's just saying this ideological approach to it means that we don't really address the facts, and we're not at the level of asking, what would actually make a difference to people who are genuinely being harmed in these situations. And I would go on to say it stops us asking important questions that we will answer or attempt to answer in our next series, which is, what do you need to believe about women to adopt these ideas? What are the unstated assumptions about women? And I'll give you a hint, some of them that are women are infants not capable of making their own decisions, that underlie all of this rhetoric, including by feminists who put themselves in a privileged position to tell everybody else what they can and can't do. There are these unstated assumptions about women that I think it stops us from really looking at those. And so we're going to look at those in our next session. So thanks for joining me on this quite heavy topic and hanging in there with me. And we'll take some questions if there are any, and then we'll wrap us up.
All right, we're going to start with Matt. And if anyone else would like to ask a question after Matt, please raise your virtual hand.
Hey, Kevin, thank you so much for this. It's really heavy, like you said, but it's really illuminating. Like, I love being able to get this stuff out into the light and talk about it. I really appreciate you doing this work. My question is, Karen, I have a friend, actually a couple friends here on this island, where their sex trafficking is like a very hot topic for them. And it's so hot that it's like you said, there's like so much outrage that when, you know, I love this person in particular, this one person, and she's a good friend. And anytime it comes to topics like sex trafficking or like trans rights, or there's certain things where it's like the outrage is so strong and the discussion gets so triggery that I just can't even handle it. And I just really just like back off as fast as possible. I just kind of change the subject or walk away or kind of divert her to someone else's attention or something like that. And I'm wondering, like, you know, how do you approach someone like that? Because I know, you know, there's some kind of like connection that's being wanted there. There's something that I potentially can offer in terms of like softening things up, making things more pliable somehow. And I just don't really know how to do that. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how to approach something like that.
Yeah, one of the ways is really acknowledge the concern and the desire that they have, you know, for safety and protection, and spend way more time focusing on the importance of that and why that's important and how that's important, so you can establish common ground with them around the things that they care about, which you also care about. It's easy to get into a situation where because in any conversation, you're operating at different levels of abstraction. And most of the time where people stop agreeing is that they've moved to a different level of abstraction in the conversation without realizing it. And so, you know, I know you, and I know that you have this intense care for the well-being of all people. And it's very clear from this person that, I don't know if it's he or she or they, but that they do too. And so, you know, kind of if you can keep it at that level of abstraction for as long as possible before moving anywhere else into, you know, facts or debates or notions, then that builds a sort of a common ground. The second thing I would say is really learn to argue the other side's point better than they can. So before you go in there with your point, know how to articulate why, you know, sex trafficking is bad, what the facts are about the number of people. I mean, some of those facts get twisted and contorted for ideological reasons, but get the facts and know the facts about their side of the situation. You know, in preparing for these talks, I've watched maybe 5 or 6 hours of Catherine McKinnon talking, so that I know what's important to her, what she thinks is relevant, what she finds interesting, what kind of arguments she makes, so that, you know, you really get to know that side of the argument, because nobody, you know, nobody like wants to be an authoritarian tyrant. You know, nobody thinks of themselves as evil. They're all trying to achieve something. So trying to help do that. And it's, you know, it's very easy to say that. And when you're in the conversation, you know, sometimes I guess there's also just realizing that there are certain topics that the reason we keep, so this debate is at least 120 years old, and older actually. And the reason we still have it is because it's complicated and because it's nuanced. And so there isn't necessarily ever going to be a resolution, but we have to keep talking about it because it's the foundation of everything we do. And so just having some allowance for, maybe we're just going to fight about this a lot.
Got it. Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
Next, we'll go to Joe, and after Joe, we'll have Rachel.
Right. Hey, Kevin. This is really good, and let's see if I can articulate, you know, what I was picking up on, and see if there's a question there. And that is, during part of your discussion about trafficking versus prostitution, I noticed that, well, trafficking humans can, the reason for the trafficking can be multifaceted, from workers in a field to sex to lots of different reasons. And I noticed, like, there's this problem with trafficking, and then they pick an erotic thing like sex, and they attach this problem to that erotic. It's like the loathing is for the erotic, but they're taking this thing that they loathe and they're saying, oh, let's pin it on the erotic. And then you have these people where they have to, I heard when you were talking about someone talking about sex workers, and it was like, it spins it, and it's like, oh, well, if you're advocating for sex workers, then you're advocating for trafficking. And now it goes both ways. Like anyone who is in this erotic space now has to defend themselves against something that isn't explicit to the erotic. And so I picked up on that, and I wonder if you noticed, and this might be similar to what you were telling Matt, but like, are people out there who do a good job of articulating that difference, just to start to help people separate between, like, actually there's this erotic element and you're pinning this thing on the erotic. Can you separate them?
Right. And, you know, like, this is potentially going to be a controversial statement, but in a certain way, for people who have closed down, you know, it's like we get our erotic fix one way or another. And for people who have determined to sort of not get their erotic in a, you know, in an explicit way, it's either too dangerous or they don't want to do it or it grosses them out or whatever, they have a tendency to then go and get it by a sort of a mental fixation on, you know, let's say it's anti-pornography or anti-prostitution. You know, it's like, it gives you a way to engage with this thing that you kind of need, but it's almost like if the sort of male grasping version of attachment to a certain form of sexuality that objectifies women and has no reference to the actual, and is kind of dehumanizing, if that's the attachment version, then this aversion version of like, well, I don't want sex, but I don't want it so much that I'm going to dedicate my life to, you know, writing policy papers about it, is actually a way to kind of get erotically engaged. It's just like the crack version of the actual erotic.
Oh, wow, that's a great point. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Next we'll go with Rachel.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was really, really interesting. I love how you kind of open the lid and there's just so much under there that you didn't even know, you know, that all of the kind of historical things that go into where we are now is really interesting. So thanks. My question, or more of a statement, and I think Joe also touched on it, is there seems to be this kind of creep, not in a creepy way, but like a, you know, the expansion of criminalization of activity from something that I think everyone can agree is actually not what anyone wants, which is people being forced to do things that they don't want to do. I think everyone on this call could agree, like no one thinks that's a good idea. But what I hear you saying with the latest case law is that, or the latest policy is that it's just creeping further and further out into voluntary activities that are, you know, sex or sex adjacent. Like in the case where you described someone, you know, touching someone, that's not even sex. And obviously if it's unwanted touch, it shouldn't be allowed, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems like the, you know, this policy is going further and further out, and it seems like people aren't aware of the implications of it. Just like, you know, after 9/11, all of these laws were introduced about surveillance that, you know, everyone agrees we don't want people to fly planes into buildings, but everyone probably also agrees that they don't want the government surveilling their emails. And so, you know, it just seems like what you're describing is this kind of invasion of the state into the bedroom in a way that I don't know that people really appreciate. And not even the bedroom, and, you know, not even in non-sexual areas.
Yeah, I think absolutely people don't appreciate it. You know, I had to look very hard to find Julie Dahlström's article, because there's all these cases that in the media, and they've passed more or less unremarked on, you know, that here and there's a quote, or the lawyer for the other side gets like kind of one sentence, but it's become kind of, you know, the notion of protecting victims becomes such a sacred cow that we can't actually have the real conversation, which ironically means you can't actually protect the victims. You know, this notion of victim protection makes it impossible to actually get to a point where we could find genuinely healthy solutions. And I think it's I'm going to use some hyperbole myself, but I think it's criminally under discussed and under reported on, even within the legal community. I've spoken to lots of lawyers about this, and, you know, I sort of find it quite difficult to get anyone to pay attention. So, you know, and I think that goes back to this sort of trance we have around sexuality. And I think it goes back to the fact that we're in a time of women taking power at a time when they're also having to come to terms with their sexuality in a brand new way. And that's just horribly uncomfortable. And so there are going to be lots of just weird things. I mean, but you got to admit, it's a pretty strange situation that you have, you know, a feminist movement that's about taking down the patriarchy, essentially siding with people who are determined to keep the patriarchy in place in the name of promoting their agenda. Like women's power, when you get there, it seems like genuine women's power, and I would always point back to Audre Lorde in this, has to be something slightly different from that. And I'm not saying those are not powerful women, because they clearly are, because, you know, that group of women shifted the law for 40 years and continues to shift it in dramatic ways. So there is definitely female power there. There's definitely feminine power there. I just wish it wasn't so, you know, authoritarian and invasive of liberty.
Thank you.
All right. I think that's all the questions we have. Thanks for joining us, and come back next week and we'll continue our journey.